Forget the Hollywood version. Forget the perfectly timed duels, the clang of shining swords that sound like church bells, and the triumphant music swelling as heroes carve their way through the enemy. That world never existed. The truth is far stranger, darker, and more human. Medieval battles weren't stories. They were storms of confusion and fear, where survival often depended less on skill than on sheer luck. If you had stood on a battlefield in the Middle Ages, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the glory, but the chaos. Signals to attack. Those dramatic horns we imagine echoing across fields were nearly useless to the average soldier. The man blowing the horn usually stood well behind the lines, somewhere safe. By the time the sound reached you, buried in a mass of men, sweat, and steel, you could barely hear it. In fact, horn players held one of the safest jobs in medieval war. Chroniclers even joked that they outlived most soldiers, second only to kings who started the wars and rarely saw the front lines themselves. Then came the first moments of movement. No polished, thunderous charge like in the tapestries. Instead, half the front line stumbled almost immediately. Mud, hidden roots, uneven ground all conspired to send men tumbling forward. Imagine dozens of armored soldiers falling face first, screaming about ankles or crushed toes before a single weapon even struck. It looked less like the march of fearsome warriors and more like a clumsy human wave tripping over itself. And if you were in that wave, you weren't charging like a hero. You were shuffling, knees trembling after hours of standing in formation, legs numb with fear. The man next to you reeked of sweat, garlic, and nerves. Medieval breath mints weren't a thing, which meant shouting was both a war tactic and a coping mechanism. Everyone yelled, not to intimidate the enemy, but to drown out the smell of the man beside them, and more importantly, their own terror. Chroniclers describe the noise of battle not as rhythmic or ordered, but as a storm of human panic. Soldiers screamed words that had no meaning. Studies of combat psychology today confirm that up to 70% of fighters make involuntary noises they later forget. If we translated those cries, they'd probably sound less like battle slogans and more like, "Help, I regret everything." Then came the first contact. A crash, not cinematic clashing steel, but the thud of bodies colliding. Someone slammed into your shield. The vibration ran up your arm until your teeth rattled. A man behind you screamed into your ear, or maybe he headbutted you without realizing. The noise was deafening, not heroic music, but a wall of grunts, curses, metal striking wood, and flesh colliding with flesh. You couldn't hear commands. You couldn't even hear yourself think. Within seconds, the dream of glory shattered. All you wanted was to remain standing. Falling meant death, not necessarily from a blade, but from the trampling boots of men who didn't even notice you were there. Archaeologists uncovering medieval battle sites often find skeletons face down in inches of mud, suffocated without a wound. That was the reality. Sometimes you didn't die from a sword, but from the earth itself, smothering you while others kept fighting overhead. Your arms ached from holding a shield that felt heavier with every blow. The sun, when it was out, roasted you inside layers of armor and padded gambeson. It was less like a warrior's uniform and more like being sealed inside a portable sauna. Chroniclers wrote of men collapsing not from wounds, but from sheer heat, their bodies giving out long before their courage did. Some knights lost 10 or 15 pounds in sweat during a single day of fighting, and in that shrinking, suffocating world, all you could really see was the eyes of the man across from you. Wide, terrified, reflecting your own confusion. Neither of you was truly fighting for honor or glory. You were fighting not to collapse in the mud, not to vanish beneath the weight of others. And in that unspoken glance, both of you might have thought the same thing. Whoever told us this was glorious deserves to rot in hell. And this was only the beginning. The first clash of a medieval battle wasn't a duel, it was an earthquake made of men. Shields slammed, bodies pressed forward, and the line buckled like a wooden fence under too much weight. You didn't fight as an individual. You fought as a single piece inside a human machine, a trembling cog that could be crushed at any moment. The noise was relentless. Your ears rang, not from a single blow, but from dozens landing all around you. The grunt of a man being shoved, the thud of metal on wood, the scream of someone hit where armor failed. Imagine being trapped in the middle of a stampede, pressed so close that you could barely lift your sword, only jab it forward like a desperate man on a crowded streetcar. That was combat, not elegance, not choreography, just frantic stabs and shoves in a suffocating crush, and the ground beneath you betrayed you as much as the enemy ahead. Fields chosen for battle were rarely flat. They were farmland, meadows, riverbanks, places with roots, rocks, and ankle-breaking holes. Within seconds, the earth turned slick with trampled grass, blood, and vomit. More men fell, and those who fell rarely rose. Once you were down, you had seconds to scramble up before boots or hooves crushed you, before weapons found the soft gaps in your armor. Chroniclers describe men suffocating face down in mud, only a few inches deep. Death came as silently from the earth as from the blade. The sun made it worse. Beneath layers of linen, wool padding, and iron plates, you cooked. Inside a helmet, air was hot, damp, and scarce. Surviving records mention that within 20 minutes of sustained fighting, temperatures inside helmets rose above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Some soldiers collapsed, not because an enemy struck them, but because their bodies simply gave out. The Fundy Battle of Agincourt in 1415 left French knights sprawled in the mud, suffocating in their own armor before English arrows or swords could even reach them. And if the sun wasn't the enemy, then the rain was. A downpour turned the field into a swamp. A knight at the Battle of Crécy in 1346 was found drowned, face first in a puddle, unable to lift his armor-heavy body from the water. For every warrior slain by a blade, another was undone by weight, heat, or terrain. Still, you forced yourself forward, legs trembling, breath ragged. Your shield arm ached, your fingers burned where leather straps cut into your skin. The man beside you heaved like a bellows, his garlic-stained breath mixing with the iron scent of blood in the air. Every step felt like dragging yourself deeper into a furnace, and the fear clung to you like a second skin. But there was no time to feel it fully. Within moments of the clash, your world collapsed into one purpose: staying upright. That was the first unwritten law of medieval battle. Do not fall. For to fall was to vanish beneath the press of men, the trampling boots, the crushing shields. Survival meant balancing on trembling legs in a sea that wanted to pull you down. So the glory of war, praised in poems and painted in tapestries, revealed itself in truth, a desperate struggle simply to stand. If you survived the first collision, the real battle began, and it looked nothing like the duels in movies. Medieval combat wasn't a contest of skillful swordplay, but a violent scrum, closer to a rugby match gone mad. Bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Weapons clashed at awkward angles. Strategy collapsed into a primal struggle where the rules of honor disappeared within minutes. Don't forget the myth of knights seeking fair, one-on-one duels. On the battlefield, ganging up on a single opponent was not cowardice, it was good sense. 5 against 1 wasn't dishonorable, it was efficient. The only code of conduct that mattered was the same one whispered by terrified peasants and seasoned knights alike: go home alive. That crushing press of men meant you rarely had space for wide, cinematic swings. Your weapon moved in bursts of 6 inches at a time, stabbing forward, jabbing like a man trying to poke his way through a crowd. Swordsmanship as taught in fencing halls, those elegant flourishes and calculated parries shattered the moment. Hundreds of sweating, panicked men shoved against you, but medieval fighters adapted. The pommel of a sword, the heavy knob at the handle's base, became as deadly as its blade. Soldiers gripped their swords by the steel, swinging the hilt like a hammer in what was grimly called the murder stroke. This was no fancy flourish. It was raw practicality. Training manuals from masters like Fiore de Liberi and Hans Talhofer show illustrations of men gripping blades barehanded, driving pommels into faces, or thrusting swords like spears into the cracks of armor. Techniques designed in practice for precision devolved in battle into instinctive brutality. Helmets turned vision into guesswork. A narrow slit gave you only glimpses of shapes, metal flashes, mud, eyes wide with terror. Many knights later admitted they never truly saw who struck them, only that something moved, and they hit back. Some chroniclers even describe soldiers accidentally swinging at shadows, convinced they were enemies. The battlefield rewarded improvisation. If your sword was too long to maneuver, you half-sworded, gripping it by the blade and using it like a short spear. If your weapon broke, you used whatever was left, even swinging with the crossguard. Men struck with elbows, knees, fists, teeth. One account from a Burgundian soldier tells of biting through an opponent's ear when his weapon was lost. And in the din of this frenzy, pain became just another sound. The roar of men wasn't only from courage, but from terror, rage, and the need to silence their own thoughts. Chroniclers remark how the battlefield sounded like a storm at sea, voices rising and crashing in waves until no single cry could be understood. Glory? There was none. The truth of medieval combat was this: it was messy, it was brutal, and it was never fair. And as your arm shook, your vision blurred, and your weapon felt heavier than stone, you began to realize that battle wasn't about defeating the enemy, it was about surviving the chaos long enough to see another sunrise. Armor was supposed to be salvation, the shining shell that turned men into knights. But on the battlefield, that salvation often became a prison. Yes, it saved lives, deflecting blades and arrows, but it also trapped heat, suffocated lungs, and blinded vision until survival became as much about endurance as about skill. Inside a helmet, the world shrank to a narrow slit. You could see perhaps a few feet ahead, blurs of movement, the glint of steel, eyes darting in panic. Peripheral vision was gone. A strike from the side or behind often arrived before you even knew it existed. Some helmets were padded to muffle blows, but that padding also muffled sound. Orders barked by commanders vanished in the din. Soldiers later recalled that once the fighting began, they could hardly tell whether the horn had blown, whether men were retreating, or whether they were alone. And then came the heat. The padded gambeson beneath your mail was thick, stuffed with layers of linen or wool. Over that hung chainmail or plate. Under the summer sun, it was less protection and more furnace. Experiments with reconstructed armor show that after only 20 minutes of fighting, the air inside a knight's helmet could climb well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That meant dizziness, blurred vision, and collapse long before the enemy's blade found you. Chroniclers at Agincourt in 1415 describe French knights falling in heaps, not from wounds, but from suffocation and exhaustion. Rain was no kinder. A sudden storm turned armor into an anchor. The iron plates soaked, the leather straps slick. A man knocked into a ditch or puddle often drowned because he simply couldn't lift himself out. Archaeologists studying skeletons at battle sites like Visby in 1361 found bodies still strapped in armor, lying face down with no visible wounds. They hadn't been slain. They had been swallowed by mud. And falling was the one mistake you couldn't afford. In the frenzy of the press, once you went down, the weight of dozens of men bore down upon you. Your armor kept blades at bay, but it also pinned you to the earth. The average soldier had less than 2 seconds to stand before boots crushed ribs, or a spear probed into gaps. Those who failed left no glorious corpse, only another body in the growing carpet of the fallen. For all its reputation, Armor didn't make you invincible, it made you slow, clumsy, and desperately hot. Yes, it could stop a slash. Yes, it might deflect a glancing blow. But inside, your body trembled under the weight of heat, exhaustion, and fear. And when you locked eyes through your visor with the man across from you, both of you knew the same. Truth. The shining shell wasn't a gift of glory. It was a coffin you were trying to outlast. The battlefield was not a museum of gleaming weapons. It was a junkyard of brutal tools, crafted with one purpose: to break the fragile human body beneath layers of cloth and steel. The romance of the sword belongs to poems and tapestries. In reality, the medieval arsenal was ugly, practical, and terrifying. Axes came first. Simple, brutal, and effective. Most weren't special war axes forged for knights, but modifications of the same tools. Peasants used to chop wood. Swing hard enough, and the edge could bite through shields, armor, and bone. You didn't need years of training to use one physics. Did the work. That's why armies armed poorly trained levies with them. Yet there was a danger. Once an axe sank into something, it often stuck. Battlefield finds show axe heads locked in shattered ribs or buried in wood, their owners cut down as they tried to yank them free. Chroniclers compared it to a curse. The moment your weapon stuck, your life was over. If axes were crude, spears were clever. Cheap, quick to make, and lethal in numbers, they armed as much as 70% of many medieval armies. A spear gave reach. You could stab a man from 6 feet away. Before he closed in, entire lines of soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their spears forming bristling walls of wood and iron. Against cavalry, a hedge of spears could stop a charge cold. But in the chaos of close quarters, their length became a curse. Men jabbed wildly and missed, or worse, skewered their own allies. Records from battles across Europe describe men pierced from behind by their friend's clumsy thrust. On the battlefield, you learned to distrust not only your enemy's spear, but your own sides as well. Then there was the mace. No elegance, no sharp edge. Just a heavy iron head meant to crush instead of cut. As armor grew stronger, slashing became useless, so the solution was to dent the armor inward, turning the knight's own protection into a cage of broken bones. Religious knights favored them too. Church councils sometimes forbade shedding blood, and a mace offered a convenient loophole: crush a man's skull without spilling a drop. Medieval logic declared it righteous. As one chronicler put it, "I did not spill his blood, only his brains." Swords, of course, have stolen the glory of medieval imagination. In truth, they were rare. A good sword could cost as much as a peasant's home, forged from high-quality steel and requiring a skilled hand to wield. Nobles carried them not only as weapons, but as symbols of rank. For the common soldier, a sword was a dream. Even knights often found them disappointing in battle. Archaeological studies show countless swords repaired again and again, nicked, snapped in half. Nothing spoiled a man's courage faster than seeing his 1,000-coin blade break on the first swing, leaving him with an expensive stick. And then came the desperate tools, farm implements pressed into war. Flails, threshing tools, sharpened shovels, pitchforks. Peasant levies marched into battle with the same equipment they used to harvest crops. At the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, chroniclers describe Lithuanian peasants swinging flails in wild arcs, breaking helmets and scattering knights. It was humiliating for a noble to be felled not by a polished blade, but by the tool of a farmer. Death by shovel was not glorious, but it was permanent. Weapon quality varied wildly. Some nobles wielded masterpieces, their hilts gilded and edges sharp as razors. But the majority of soldiers held mass-produced tools of questionable quality. Rust, loose handles, weak welds all plagued the common man's gear. Chronicles describe men throwing aside snapped spears and broken swords, seizing whatever they could from the ground. In war, even a rock or a fallen branch could serve as a weapon. The battlefield itself became an armory. These weren't instruments of honor, they were instruments of ruin, each designed to pierce, crush, or tear apart the fragile machine of flesh. And when they struck, they did more than kill. They left wounds so horrific that they haunted survivors for the rest of their days. For the weapon was only the beginning. The real horror came after the strike. The medieval battlefield was not painted in clean sword cuts or tidy duels. It was a butcher's floor, soaked in blood, where the human body revealed just how fragile it truly was. Every weapon left its own signature, and none of them were merciful. Armor offered some hope, but it was no miracle. A sword might glance off chainmail once, maybe twice, but an axe or mace simply drove the metal inward. Mail links folded into flesh, turning protection into part of the wound. Chronicles and medical accounts reveal knights hauled from the battlefield with bones shattered beneath armor that still looked intact. To the eye, they were unharmed. Inside, they were broken. The strikes themselves rarely made clean wounds. A sword blow to the shoulder didn't leave a neat cut, it tore muscle, cracked collarbones, and sometimes carried the whole arm with it. Mace strikes collapsed ribs inward, rupturing lungs and hearts. Soldiers called it the silent death, because outwardly the victim bore no wound. Yet within minutes they gasped and choked until still. Modern doctors would call it internal bleeding. Medieval surgeons had only one term: too late, and blood it poured fast, far faster than stories allow. The human body holds about 10 pints, and losing even 2 could mean unconsciousness. Accounts suggest men often bled out within 5 minutes of receiving a major cut. Many didn't realize how badly they were wounded until their knees buckled. And the world tilted into black. The horrors were not only from blades. Teeth shattered when helmets were struck. Splinters from broken shields gouged eyes. A glancing blow could peel away an ear or shatter a jaw. At Visby in 1361, archaeologists uncovered skulls split clean through, others caved in from blunt force. The wounds were not the tidy kills of cinema. They were grotesque, mutilating, impossible to forget. And then came the enemy no one could see: infection. For every man who died on the field, 3 more perished afterward from festering wounds. There were no medics waiting in neat tents, no sterile bandages, no antiseptics. A belt strap served as a tourniquet. A hot dagger pressed to a wound was surgery. If you were lucky, a monk might pray over you as he sawed off a limb to save your life. Battlefield hospitals, when they existed, were little more than straw-filled tents where groaning men waited for the knife. Amputation was quick, brutal, and rarely survived. Records show only about 30% lived through the procedure. And the tools? They weren't sterilized. At best, a surgeon wiped them on his tunic before plunging them into the next wound. Infection spread like wildfire. Fevers raged, wounds festered, and men lingered for days before death finally claimed them. Even minor injuries, a cut across the hand, a gouged cheek, could turn fatal when rot set in. The pain was unimaginable. Soldiers described wounds that never closed, scars that reopened with each movement. Some limped for life, others lived without eyes, ears, or arms. And the survivors carried more than broken bodies. They carried broken minds. Many spoke of visions, of horrors replayed in dreams, of sudden screams in the night as if struck again. Brutality of wounds was not just in the dying. It was in the surviving. For to live after battle meant carrying the scars, both flesh and memory, until the grave. And as terrible as these injuries were, the battlefield was about to strip away even more the mind itself. Steel and blood broke the body, but the battlefield shattered the mind. Even the strongest warrior, armored from head to toe, could not shield himself from the chaos inside his own head. After only minutes of combat, disorientation set in. Where am I? Which way is the enemy? These questions haunted soldiers almost immediately. Surrounded by thousands of men pressed together, spinning to face blows from every angle, the sense of direction dissolved. Chronicles from Toten, the bloodiest. Battle of the Wars of the Roses. Note that soldiers often had no idea where their commanders stood. Some men advanced straight into friendly lines, slashing at their own allies by mistake. Confusion killed as many as blades. Colors and banners were meant to prevent this, but once drenched in mud and blood, they vanished into the haze. Helmets muffled voices, battle smoke stung eyes, and every soldier became a blur of iron and desperation. Records from the Battle of Barnet in 1471 claim that entire groups of soldiers attacked their own side, mistaking them for the enemy. In the panic, trust collapsed. Even the man beside you could suddenly seem like a threat, and then came the most terrifying question: is this my blood? The battlefield drenched men in crimson, sometimes from their own wounds, sometimes from those around them. Soldiers wrote of moments when they could not tell whether they were injured, until dizziness or sudden collapse revealed the truth. Others described the surreal experience of being soaked head to toe in gore, yet unharmed. For some, the uncertainty was worse than pain itself. As minutes dragged on, the brain faltered. You no longer fought with reason, you fought with reflex. Training drilled into you in musters or fencing halls might surface, but thought itself shut down. Modern psychologists call it battle mind, when the body acts before the brain can think. Soldiers later confessed they remembered nothing of their strikes. One knight described it as being carried by a storm, his body moving without his command. Tunnel vision followed. Eyes narrowed, focusing only on flashes, an arm moving, a weapon glinting. Soldiers stopped seeing enemies as men. They became shapes, movements, threats. Friend or foe mattered less than whether it was advancing toward you. Chroniclers compare this to madness. Warriors striking blindly, screaming at shadows, hacking at anything that came too close. For those who endured long enough, the world itself seemed to warp. Time stretched and collapsed. Minutes felt like hours. Hours disappeared in moments. Survivors often spoke of hearing nothing, or of hearing everything at once, a roar so constant it became silence. Some claimed they floated above themselves, watching their own arms swing as if detached, and when the mind could take no more, many soldiers made the most logical choice available. They fled. Panic spread like fire. One man running could spark a chain reaction, and soon an entire line dissolved into chaos. The chronicles that praise heroic last stands rarely mention that most ordinary fighters clung to a different truth. Graveyard is full of heroes. The tavern is full of runners. The battlefield was not just a clash of armies. It was a war against the human mind, a test few passed without scars. For those who did survive, what they carried away was not glory, but ghosts, memories they could never silence. History books glorify the warriors who stood firm, but the truth is simpler and far more human. Most men ran. Retreat was not always cowardice, it was survival. In the furnace of battle, when fear drowned out orders and exhaustion dragged at limbs, escape became the only strategy that made sense. Chronicles suggest that as many as 40% of medieval armies broke and fled before the fighting even reached its bloodiest stage. Not because they were weak, but because they were human. A peasant levied into service fought under no illusion of honor. He had no estate to defend, no reputation to uphold. His guiding principle was clear: I want to see my family again. But once one man ran, panic rippled through the ranks like lightning. Battles often ended not with a heroic charge, but with a chain reaction of fear. At Hastings in 1066, whole segments of the Saxon army crumbled, breaking formation as Norman cavalry pressed forward. At Toten in 1461, fought in a blizzard of snow, tens of thousands surged back and forth until one line cracked and fled. What followed was slaughter. Fleeing men were cut down from behind, drowning in rivers or trampled in their own route. The choice to flee carried its own dangers. Running in armor was nearly impossible. Knights who bolted often collapsed from exhaustion within a few hundred yards, easy prey for pursuers. Some soldiers faked death, throwing themselves among corpses and lying still for hours. Others hid behind wagons, under bridges, or in ditches. One French soldier, desperate and inventive, survived by crawling inside the body of a dead horse, waiting until the battlefield grew quiet. He lived, but imagine the silence that followed him for the rest of his life. For peasants, there was no shame in running. They said, "The graveyard is full of heroes, the tavern is full of runners." But for nobles, the stakes were different. A knight's honor, his name, his lineage, these chained him to the fight. To flee was worse than death. Chronicles tell of knights who rode into hopeless battles rather than risk disgrace. Yet even among them, many chose life over legacy when the slaughter grew unbearable. Medieval chroniclers, often writing for kings and nobles, painted running as shameful, a betrayal of valor. But when you strip away the poetry and look at the battlefield itself, retreat was often the most rational act a man could take. And as countless armies discovered, battles were rarely won by strength alone. They were won when the other side decided that survival mattered more than glory. When the noise finally ebbed, when swords no longer struck and shields no longer pressed, victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like silence, an eerie, suffocating silence, broken only by groans, crows, and the shuffling of the still living across fields of the dead. If you were still standing, you had won. That was the only measure of success. There were no parades, no speeches, no shining banners raised in triumph. The prize was not glory. It was simply the breath in your lungs, the ache in your arms, the realization that you had not been swallowed by the mud. Chroniclers describe survivors sinking to the ground in exhaustion, too drained even to cheer. Some sat staring at nothing, while others wept quietly, shaking from the shock of still being alive. The battlefield itself became a market of death. Men scavenged weapons from the fallen, stripping armor from corpses regardless of which side they had served. Boots, belts, and helmets were pulled away as spoils. Nothing went to waste. Iron was valuable, leather was precious, and a good blade, even blood-stained and nicked, could be repaired. To live meant to steal from the dead. Then came the drinking. Chroniclers write that after Toten, men drank for days, trying to drown what their eyes had witnessed. They did not celebrate, they numbed themselves. Victory was not a song of pride, but a desperate plea to forget. In England, one monk noted how survivors staggered into taverns, still streaked with blood, ordering ale before even washing their wounds. The wounded who made it off the field faced another battlefield, the surgeon's tent. Field hospitals divided. Men into two categories: might live and probably won't. Amputations were swift, performed without anesthetic, often with a hot blade cauterizing the wound. The stench of burned flesh filled the air. Mortality in these tents was staggering. In many cases, half of those brought in did not survive the night. For days afterward, bruises darkened, fevers rose, nightmares haunted the sleep of survivors. Men twitched in their beds, arms jerking as though still raising shields. Wives wrote of waking to sudden blows from husbands fighting phantoms in their dreams. Medieval chronicles speak less of heroes and more of haunted men. And the battlefield itself, it lingered. No one cleared it. Bodies rotted where they fell. Farmers plowed fields years later, their plows catching on iron fragments, bones, and rusted mail. Children played in meadows that had once been killing grounds, sometimes stumbling upon skulls in the soil. Victory did not vanish with the battle. It remained, festering in the earth. So when we imagine medieval triumphs, kings saluting their knights, soldiers shouting their glory, we should remember what victory truly was. It was exhaustion. It was silence. It was stripping armor from corpses while trying not to look into their open eyes. And above all, It was the grim relief of knowing you had survived a day that swallowed so many others. Surviving the field did not mean the battle was over. For many, the real war began afterward. Wounds lingered, fevers consumed, and nightmares clung tighter than armor ever had. Victory was fleeting. The scars remained. The physical aftermath was merciless. Soldiers returned home limping, blinded, or missing limbs. In villages, men with crude wooden prosthetics or empty sleeves became walking reminders of battles the chroniclers praised, but peasants quietly mourned. A knight might survive, but with one eye gone, his career and often his family's fortune ended. Common soldiers fared worse. A farmhand without a hand was no longer a farmhand. Some were left to beg, their glory reduced to hunger at the roadside. The mental shadows cut just as deep. Records from monasteries describe men waking screaming in the night, swinging fists at invisible foes, or begging forgiveness from ghosts only they could see. We would call it trauma, even post-traumatic stress. They had no name for it, but they lived it. Families whispered of battle madness, of fathers who startled at sudden noises, or veterans who wandered fields alone, lost in memories that the land itself remembered too. Medieval battlefields were not cleaned. Corpses lay where they fell, picked apart by animals and weather. Farmers who later worked those fields reported plows catching on bones, or rusted sword tips surfacing after rains. In some places, legends grew that fields were cursed because no grass would grow where too much blood had been spilled. Even centuries later, archaeologists still uncover bones and weapons from battles forgotten by time. Reminders that the earth never forgets what men tried to bury, and yet, out of this carnage, stories of glory were woven. Kings hired poets and chroniclers to turn slaughter into legend. Pain became triumph. Death became sacrifice. But those who had stood in the mud knew better. They knew the truth. Medieval battle was not noble, not clean, not heroic. It was chaos and heat, confusion and fear, wounds that never healed, and memories that never faded. Perhaps that is why the survivors often clung to life all the harder afterward. They drank, they prayed, they raised children, they tilled the earth, because they had seen how quickly existence could be ripped away. To them, victory was not a crown, not a song, not a place in history. Victory was the simple, miraculous act of still drawing breath when the crows came down to feed. The long shadow of battle followed them until death, but perhaps, in some strange way, survival itself was the only true triumph a medieval soldier ever knew.